Well, relationships bring us one of the most precious sources of joy in our lives, but they're also messy, and they can sometimes bring us one of life's greatest sources of pain as well. You know, more you get to know people, more you realize that very few people don't have issues, relational issues in their family. And it's amazing how many families have long-running feuds where there's bitter resentment which has been built up over years, jealousy which has fueled all sorts of things up and led to people not speaking to each other, and all sorts of unresolved conflict. You know, it's there in so many of our families, especially across the Forest of Dean and Wye Valley. It's so prevalent. And this is one of the great things about the Bible. You know, the Bible doesn't gloss things up. It says it as it is. And, you know, when we read this story of Joseph, we see his family was no different from our families in so many ways. And this whole picture of relational turmoil comes to the fore. And if you've not read it, you know, I encourage you to read Genesis chapter 37 to 50, because it's an action-packed story which is compelling and gripping. And I've just been living in this book of Genesis the last few weeks, because I just keep finding so many new things which are encouraging me and challenging me as I go along. So just keep reading it and reading it different translations of the Bible, and I'm sure you'll find a huge blessing in it too. But when you read through the story of Joseph, you find, you know, Joseph was the favourite son of Jacob, his father. And that in itself raises a question. It's his brothers felt that they became jealous because they felt he was favoured. And so there's a question there for parents, or a challenge, you know, the importance of being fair and treating all your children equally, because it creates all sorts of untold problems down the line if you aren't. And of course, as a result, he was hated by his brothers, and they became insanely jealous of him. And that jealousy became totally destructive. And they wanted to kill him. When they saw their chance, as a 17-year-old, he was coming to bring them some food and report back to the father how they were getting on. They saw their chance, and they were going to kill him, but then they decided to put him in a pit instead. And then, of course, he went from a pit where they then sold him into slavery. And if that wasn't bad enough, he was then falsely accused in slavery of trying to rape his master's wife and thrown into prison. And so he had this horrendous story that he went through, a true story. And we don't know what happened when Joseph was in that pit, but we can imagine. The Bible gives us a few clues and a few hints what happened in that place. In Genesis 42 and verse 21, it says his brothers later on in life were saying this, you know, they were talking about things going wrong in their own lives. They said, clearly we are being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why we're in this trouble. And you know, that phrase that we saw his anguish, you see, Joseph would have been in that pit, and there was great anguish and terror and fear. He would have heard them saying, well, let's kill him. And I'm sure there was a sense of desperation. There was a sense of hopelessness. There was a sense of despair that flooded into his heart. And normally when someone goes into those kind of experiences and perhaps comes out the other end physically intact, but emotionally and mentally they're messed up completely, and often this can lead to deep resentment and massive bitterness, which totally messes their lives up from there on in. And so this morning I just want us to think about, maybe you feel that you're in a pit, you feel helpless, and perhaps that sense of, for you, desperation and fear is setting in. I feel like me, if I'm shut in a confined space for too long on my own, I start climbing the walls. It's not good for me, and certainly not good for people around me. And so I can understand and I can identify with that. Perhaps you've got relational issues going on in your family, and they're leading you to feel a sense of despair. Or maybe there's some kind of unresolved conflict, which is making you feel bitter inside towards someone else. and you feel like you're in that pit. So what can you do? What can we do if we find ourselves in those positions? Well, I think Joseph gives us so much encouragement and so much help that we don't have to stay in that place. And the first thing I would say that we can learn from Joseph, we can ask God to use these trials to make us better, not bitter. Ask God to use these trials to make us better, not bitter. Now, we don't know exactly what did happen in that pit, but I think we can guarantee one thing, that Joseph prayed. And I think his prayer would have gone something like this: help! Help me! Help me, Lord! I think that's kind of the universal prayer that goes out in those situations. But I would suggest to you that prayer of help me moved and changed and morphed, and it may have been over a period of years. He was in that time frame of pit, slavery, prison, 13 years. So he had a long time to reflect. But somewhere on that journey, I think that prayer probably changed, not from help me to actually, Lord, help my brothers. Because we can see later on in his life, right at the end in chapter 50 of Genesis, where his brothers came to him and they were fearful when their father had died, and they were thinking he's going to get his own back on us. And what did he do? He just showed them love. He showed them care. He showed them kindness. He showed them forgiveness. And he made provision for his brothers. And he actually wept at the thought that they thought he was going to get even with them. Because his heart was anything but that. You see, his heart had softened. He'd gone through a process. He hadn't become bitter. He'd become better. And he'd become more like Jesus. More like his God that he was serving. And so ask God to use the trials that you're facing, that pit that you feel trapped in, to make you better, not bitter. But then secondly, choose God's healing path of forgiveness. Choose God's healing path of forgiveness. See, Joseph's brothers intended to harm him. They wanted to get rid of him. They wanted to kill him, or at least sell him into slavery somewhere else where they would never see him again. So they thought. But Joseph chose a different pathway. He chose the path of forgiveness that brings healing and opens the door up even for restoration of relationships. And so we see how Joseph clearly forgave his brothers. And it raises a question, and I get asked this question a lot, when do you know when you've really forgiven someone? And I don't know the definitive answer to that question, but I think a good indicator for us is when it stops coming back and dominating in our minds. And so I feel whenever I feel a sense that I need to forgive someone, that actually, if it keeps coming back to my mind, I come to the Lord and say, Lord, I forgive that person. I forgive them. And just keep repeating that process. Lord, help me to forgive them. And try to sort of get to the bottom of it. And eventually there's a sense where you think, well, I haven't thought about it for weeks, days, weeks, months. And that's when I think you know that you really have forgiven them. And if it keeps coming back, just keep forgiving in your heart. And eventually you'll get there. And it'll stop becoming an issue. But of course, it's important that we forgive. And I realise that it's a tough option, because there's so many reasons why we don't want to forgive. They don't deserve it. They've caused me so much pain, so much heartache. They should face the justice and all sorts of things. And of course they should, and doesn't necessarily keep them from that. But the thing is, if we don't forgive, we've got to look at the alternative. The alternative is that we end up becoming bitter. We end up becoming consumed by that ugly resentment and become utterly twisted. And we become hell-bent on a mission just to get even and to make sure that they get retribution. And it can become all-consuming. And not only that, but it affects all our other relationships as well. And everyone else around us suffers, not just the person we want to suffer. And so the alternative to not forgiving is worse. It keeps us trapped and locked in that place. And so it's important that we choose that path of forgiveness, so it doesn't consume our lives, affect all our other relationships. And that's clearly what Joseph did. But then there's an interesting element to this, and one of the reasons many people struggle to forgive is they think that if they forgive someone, they have to fully trust that person again. Well, Joseph makes it, gives us a blueprint here, and a great example of how you move forward once you've forgiven someone. You see, he didn't just trust his brothers straight away. You see, he gave time to restoring the trust. And we're to give time to restoring the trust. And you read through Genesis 42 to 50, you can see how he did this. When his brothers first came to him, when the famine had set in, he was the ruler in Egypt at the time, or the number 2 in control. And his brothers came to him, and he recognized them. But of course, he was 17 when they said goodbye to him. He was this was 20 odd years later. He was well versed in the Egyptian way of doing things. He was dressed as an Egyptian. He looked like an Egyptian. He spoke the Egyptian language. He spoke through an interpreter to them, even though he understood what they were saying. And so they thought he was an Egyptian. They had no idea who he was. And so when they came to Joseph, he could have said, "Look, I'm Joseph. Fantastic. Oh, lovely to see you. I'm so thrilled. I'm so delighted. I've forgiven you. Just forget all those things. Come on, and we'll make sure we look after you." But he didn't. He actually set a series of tests for them. I used to think, reading this, that Joseph was a bit unkind to his brothers, and perhaps he was in some respects trying to get even with them, but I don't think he was. I think he was just trying to test them, to see whether they changed, to see whether they had repented of what they had done to him, to see whether he could actually now trust them going forward in the future, whether that trust could be restored. And so if you read the story, you see how when they first came to him, or the 10 of them did, Benjamin stayed at home with his father because his father didn't want to lose him as well as Joseph. And Joseph said, "Okay, well, Simeon, you stay here in prison, and you've got to bring back Benjamin to me, so I will know you're not spies in the land." And then, of course, they went back home, told the father this, and he was distressed about it. But eventually, when they ran out of food again, they had no option, but they came back and took Benjamin with them. But this is the interesting point. At that point, Judah stepped up to the challenge. At that point, Judah, the one who wanted him sold into slavery, probably wanted him killed. And we read about Judah's leadership in the earlier chapters of Genesis and how he was the one that spoke up strongly. Reuben was the one who wanted to spare his life. And Judah stepped in and he said, "Look, Dad, if anything happens to Benjamin, I'm responsible. I am taking full responsibility for this. I'm going to make sure that nothing, if it depends upon me, nothing is going to happen to him." And so when Joseph said no, when he got down there, and later on they found the Joseph's cup in his bag, and they accused him of Benjamin of being a thief. Joseph at that stage said, "Okay, well, we'll have to take Benjamin as a slave and keep him here." At that stage, Judah again stepped up and gave the longest speech in the whole of the book of the 50 chapters in Genesis, and pleaded on behalf of his father so that Benjamin wouldn't be left behind. And you can see that in that speech there, Judah's heart is opened up, and he's a different Judah to the Judah earlier on in Genesis. Something has happened. There's clearly been repentance in his life. There's clearly been, yes, regrets, but also repentance and a sense of he's trying to live differently. He has a respect for his father that he didn't have in his early years. And Joseph's able to see that for himself, and to see that this is a different person, and that his brothers are different, and that this is a relationship which is the trust is starting to be rebuilt. And so that's how Joseph, and then eventually Joseph revealed and said, "Look, I'm Joseph, I'm your brother." And they were like, "Whoa, no, that can't be true." And then he said, come close, have a look, it's me, it really is me." And they could see for themselves it really was Joseph. And he went back and got his father, and the whole family was reunited in a beautiful way. Now, of course, for us today, there's no guarantees that we'll have that happy ever after ending to our story. Sometimes our relationships become broken. Sometimes relationships become messed up and messy. And we can't guarantee the outcome, but we can choose the path, God's path of healing and forgiveness. And then give that space for trust to be restored in that relationship. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. We can do our part, we can forgive, we can open up the door for that relationship to be restored. It then depends upon someone else. And if they choose not to engage in that way, we can't force them. But of course, as the Apostle Paul said himself, that in Romans chapter 12 and verse 18, that we're to do everything, all that you can, to live in peace with everyone. And so that's all we can do, as much as it depends upon us, live in peace with everyone. And so we're to do our part. Because the problem is, if we don't do our part in this, it affects all the other relationships. You see, forgiveness must be given, but trust has to be earned. That's a key thing we need to bear in mind. And there's a key learning from Joseph. I remember when I first started in Cinderford, I was challenged about my relationships. And I knew there was someone in my past who I'd held a grudge against. And I remember very early on, I went to that person and said, look, I'm really sorry, but I've held this grudge against you, and will you forgive me for this? And I sought to put it right as much as it depended upon me. And he was very gracious and came back and said, yeah, of course I do. And our relationship was restored. And I've sought to live that way ever since. And it's the only way, because it brings the life of God's Spirit into our lives. And it then refreshes the other relationships around us and makes us healthy in how we live and how we do live life in community, in our families and in our church community and in the wider community in which we live. And so I don't know your situation. Maybe you feel in a bit of a pit. But ask God to use these trials that you're facing to make you better, not bitter. Choose God's healthy path of forgiveness. I know it's tough, but it's worth it. And give time to restoring trust in your relationships. You know, you never know what God may well do if you give that time to open up a relationship to trust once again. You may even be another Joseph scenario, a family reunited, restored. And that's a beautiful thing.